The lack of recognition that followed turned out to be entirely different from what he had experienced in the harbor. In fact, the village no longer existed. When telling us that part, he avoided the term fishing village altogether and spoke instead of a village where a few fishermen lived, and his room were way back then when he had been rented out, not in a fisherman's house, but in a building described in a detailed and roundabout fashion as a stone cottage without electricity, where one got tangled at night in nets, and so forth. Which, however, as one of his listeners interrupted, amounted to the same thing as a fisherman's house, whereupon the storyteller merely corrected him briefly with, "No, not the same thing." Whatever, the house in which he had spent the nights that summer, with the Adriatic visible from the skylight in his room, was no longer standing, and likewise the couple of other houses in the village had disappeared. The emptiness there was real and physical, not virtual. The thing that had remained most present to him all this time, the tree standing among the stone cottages, in whose shade he had sat at a small kitchen table and typed day and night, day after day, in its place a bare patch, and even if he was mistaken about the exact spot, nowhere else in this vicinity could another tree be seen, or even a trace of one. No village, to say nothing of fishermen. Instead, built partway out into the ocean and onto the cliffs, a sort of a marine center, glossed in and closed at the moment altogether. And yet, this was the village with the tree, whose botanical name he did not know, although he insisted having a plane tree, and thus he took up a position and planned to stay a while in the empty space in what he had been the village center, where the waves, as close to as before, were audible as a mere lapping, also just as before. On the way to his first book, it will be some time before it deserved that name, he had also had his first girlfriend there in the island village. This girl was the first person the would-be writer, not much older than she was, had betrayed, and along with this young woman in his future book, though in a different sense, as a traitor to what he had undertaken, and what he was writing, what he intended to accomplish. This was how he already saw himself in those days. Every time they kissed or just walked around hand in hand, and he looked into her eyes, and that is how he saw himself now, sitting there alone in the void under a rather lowering sky. As a traitor to be dreamed of book, daily to be dreamed anew, and also to the girl, more as a swindler. So torn. So what he exclaimed that night on the boat. Yet it was a grand summer. Possibly as he, who otherwise did his utmost to avoid superlatives, found himself bursting out right after this remark. The grandest in my life. He had recognized the conflict early on. Yes, the incompatibility, even unsuitability. But in those days, he enjoyed the back and forth, the sweetness, and yes, the exaltation of merging with the other person's body, then spending hours alone at the table, where word after word demanded something of him that he merely intuited. But soon after, and after that again and again, soon daily, experienced against the backdrop of an unmistakable, palpably merciless menace, Only both experiences, precisely because of their incompatibility, gave him the first time something like a sense of a completeness, a sense of life. In later years, that would change. Eventually, he would find no pleasure in the conflict between being obligated on the one hand to practice the profession of a writer or recorder, and the other being a lover or a loved one. It was a form of guilt. It was culpability. The two together were criminal. Either or. The abducted writer got up and paced back and forth. Then in a circle, in the former village square or writing place or whatever he had decided to call the empty space. He had never felt a calling to write, and certain not to be forced, not before that summer. If there was to be a calling, it had to come from him alone. He had to try to discover his calling, and this at least seemed like a sign. The only sign that he had received in his life, as he had already sensed when taking leave of childhood. Perhaps his self-determination could be accomplished through writing. The former writer continued to pace back and forth and around in a circle, and eventually also backward. The lapping of the Adriatic, the ever-present island breeze, oncoming dusk, writing. What had that meant to him? Primarily an escape. An escape from what? From so-called reality? From the heavy hand of reality? From the world? The demands of the world? No, or yes. If opening one's mouth, having to speak, being told, come on, out with it, tell us, constitutes such a demand of the world, he did feel impelled to escape from it, and not by falling silent, but rather by writing things down. He, who during the Moravian Night just talked and talked, had restored to writing in order to get away from all the demanded jabber. Damned to him, yes, at least in his early years. Yet he, the villager, hailed from a region and from a clime in which orality was almost the only medium of communication, and if the written word played any role, it always evoked a suspicion associated with anything official, governmental, or it took the form chiefly of numbers of calculations. But there was no need to look beyond him and his person. It was his very own orality from which he wanted to escape. It was his own voice. It was not only that others usually found his voice too soft. Speak up, please. He himself did not want to hear his voice, and not only because it was so soft or thin or tremulous. He had only to hear himself speak, and promptly he did not want to go on speaking. He had a deep reluctance to hear himself speak, and in his early years, not those alone, when he did speak, even to himself, his own voice constantly got in the way. But when he was writing, how he could forget himself, or at least for a while, and not such a short while. Oh, the damned echo of speaking. Oh, the echo of writing. His landlord and landlady back there in the island village had probably never read a book. At least there was none to be seen in their house. Not even one about fishing. Certainly they had never had any contact with an author, let alone one like him, who was writing a book before their very eyes, and outdoors too, where they also did their work. At first they laughed at him amiably, then they were astonished at him, and by the end of the summer they actually expressed admiration for his activity, probably also because of his persistence, which matched theirs, and his refusal to let anything disturb him, and whether noises, radios, tractors, or smells beneath the sun, from which at certain times of the day no leafy wind shadows could offer protection. When an occasional bad smell wafted in his direction from the rotting fish heads and innards, he held his handkerchief over his nose and went on typing, using one finger of the free hand, and the same thing toward evening when the cows, having eaten their fill in their allen pastures, passed through the village on the way to their stalls. Not a few of them quite bloated and relieving themselves in an endless succession of farts, billow after billow, of a stench that challenged him not to lose his sense for rhythm, images indeed, or feeling, as he chose his words. What an undertaking, a grand summer. A challenge, however, not only from the outside but also from the inside. An inside that was entirely unlike him and his person. Challenge, demand, order, law, a pretentious concept. No, the proper one. As he wrote, and in that which he was writing, the book, a law was at work. Yet it began to manifest itself with the first sentence, and in the course of the writing, it became all-encompassing. And what it did express. And what it did express? Affirmation, no assurance. And on the other hand, no. On the contrary, a threat, no, a menace. And the law was absolute. It brooked neither omissions nor exceptions. And with what did it threaten him? Punishment? What kind? The menace, absolute though it was, remained unclear. But what was clear? There would be, or again on the contrary, there would not be a verdict, no, a conviction. And on the contrary meant, if he violated the law, and how would the violation become apparent? Heavens, it would be obvious the moment it happened. It would be branded on him, then and there, and it would burn inside him until the final judgment was pronounced. The menace sprung to life inside him in response to seemingly small, trivial factors. All it took was a fleeting irritation at the beat, at a wind gust that flipped over on the paper and in the typewriter, making him type the letter he was about to strike on the back instead of the front of the page. And the whole undertaking would be called into question, and with it, he himself. Anything that began with such as a touch of unhappiness over something, a vague uneasiness, an unfriendly response he caught himself making, that was enough to bring on the sense that an unnamed sanction was imminent. And how? Especially dangerous was unkindness, not merely in his action, but also in what led up to them and followed them, when he was standing in line to be waited on in a shop in Cordura, or waiting to buy a ticket at the cinema, and chafing inwardly at those ahead of him. From the beginning, he had lacked patience, and could picture himself as an infant stricken if his mother's breast was offered a fraction of a second too late, or even if the sun, for which he was constantly on the lookout, refused to emerge from behind clouds. This lack of patience, or to use another term, lack of self-control, had been his worst character defect until those months on the island. Up to the Moravian Night, and probably long after, it formed a part of his problematic relationship to time. How would he, who became downright mean in his lack of patience, ever manage to produce a book, the fruit of tranquility combined with patience, the fruit of having time, which, as I began to learn there, was the most noble of feelings, a summer fraught with danger, a summer of adventure.